And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com. Hello there. Happy New Year. I hope you and your family had a wonderful New Year's celebration. On this special New Year's Day edition of Podcast on the Brink, we have a special treat. Zach McRoberts, who has been a revelation for Indiana over these last few games, was kind enough to join me for a short interview in the day after the Youngstown State game. And so we get some great insight from Zach on just how his role has expanded, what he expects from the team moving forward. Some thoughts on Juwan Morgan as well that are really interesting. And then we also look ahead to Indiana's games against Minnesota and Wisconsin with special guest Andy Bottoms, who's here to lend his expertise on those games and the Big Ten at large. All of that on this edition of Podcast on the Brink. Buying tickets to sports and concerts can be complicated and confusing, but there is a better way to buy, and that is with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to every type of live event. Whether you're searching for a last-minute deal, planning a night out, or need to find the perfect gift, SeatGeek helps you find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed. There is nothing quite like seeing your favorite team or musician in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for a great value. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone. I can vouch that it is by far the easiest way that I have found to shop for tickets. I can be anywhere, and with just a few taps, I can instantly find seats. I'm planning on doing that with my wife. We have a 17-month-old, but we're planning some date nights out, and one of the things we're going to do is look for some musicians that we want to see, and SeatGeek will be the first place that we go to look for concert tickets here in Dallas where we live, so hopefully we can find some, because we know if they're there and if there are good prices, then we will find them on SeatGeek, because SeatGeek is designed to make your ticket buying experience easier than ever. SeatGeek saves you time and money by searching multiple ticket sites to compare prices and help you find amazing deals. And best of all, Podcast on the Brink listeners get $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. Just download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK today, BRINK, for $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. All right, my guest now on Podcast on the Brink is Zach McRoberts, whose play has been a revelation for the Hoosiers over the past several weeks. Zach, thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So are you surprised by how your role has expanded over the last few weeks?
I wouldn't say surprised. I think that's something you just got to continue to work. I think just in practice, continue to work, and then just having the opportunity and taking advantage of some things has been good.
And one of the big changes that we've seen from you is a greater willingness to shoot. And obviously, your ability is coming through because you've made several of them. What has led to your increased confidence and your increased willingness to shoot the basketball, especially from deep?
I think just being out there and feeling more comfortable in my role. And then obviously, like I've said, practice, just being able to shoot there, knock down some shots, gives you some confidence, carry over to the game.
How do you view your role? Like what do you see as your role that you bring to the team on a game-by-game basis?
Just hopefully energy, just doing anything, loose balls, rebounds, anything like that, and then just bringing energy. Not really worried about scoring. If I'm open, I'll shoot it, but I know that's not what I'm really out there to do. Just make plays in that way.
Well, and that's what makes you so fun to watch is the energy is always there, kind of that grit and that toughness. And what is your mindset as a player? Like, is that just natural for you to play with that kind of energy, or is there any element of kind of a chip on your shoulder, like you want to go out and prove, to some of these scholarship guys, that you deserve it, and that that you're kind of trying to prove yourself, or is it just natural for you to play with that type of energy and toughness?
I think that's something that started in high school, really. I think my high school coach really preached that, wanted me going to the glass every time. And that's something that starting out as a younger player, he tried to change. And so that really just stuck with me because I knew I wouldn't play in high school if I didn't do what he wanted to do. So just that kind of shaped who I was as a player. And then it's obviously worked out decent so far.
Yeah, I would say so. So,
Yeah.
so you mentioned crashing the glass. That's another question I wanted to ask you is what is your mindset as an offensive rebounder, and what makes you a good offensive rebounder, do you think? Because that's obviously where you've, had a huge impact for the team this year.
Yeah, just trying to be relentless, I guess. Trying to read the ball where it's going to go, and then not really trying to get boxed out, I guess. Just anything I can do to get away from the guy trying to hit me, and then hopefully come up with it.
And obviously the biggest offensive rebound you had was the one against Notre Dame, and you found a streaking Juwan Morgan for that big bucket. And I noticed, that happened again in the game against Youngstown State, where you got a rebound, Colin Hartman dove to the bucket, and you found him. Is that something that's designed? Like when a guy gets an offensive rebound, other guys are supposed to dive to the basket, and are you, do you kind of train yourself to look toward the basket when you get an offensive rebound?
I think that's just kind of a moment of chaos for everybody. You never really expect the offense to get a rebound like that. Free throw wise, at least that's always the point of emphasis, just block out, hit somebody. But yeah, I think it's just the chaos, and then somebody cuts the basket. It's always hard to defend, so it's worked out.
Boy, it is. I wish more guys would use that cut. Just cut straight to the basket. Good things happen a lot of times.
Yeah, it can't hurt.
Yeah. So you've played for 3 coaches now in your college basketball career. Obviously, you started at Vermont, then you played for Coach Crean last year. What is unique about playing for Coach Miller?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think, man, he's obviously very intense, really wants the best for his guys. So, I mean, I guess that's no different than coaches I've played for, obviously one of the best. He's obviously very, very defensive minded. It's very important for us. We work on it every day. Ball pressure, getting gaps, things like that. So I think he's been good for us.
Has that been a really big adjustment for you guys, going from, obviously a system that was more offensive minded to this new system that's much more defensive focused? Do you think it's been a struggle for guys to kind of make that adjustment?
I don't really know if it's a struggle is the right word, but I think it is definitely adjustment, definitely something you got to get used to. Obviously with the new coach, new staff, just a different way things are run, different way they're set up, and then obviously the whole different system. So this takes some time getting used to.
Yeah. One thing Archie said after the Tennessee Tech game that I found interesting is, he said that maybe something he's learned is that he has to be a raving lunatic for the rest of the season, to kind of get that consistent effort. Don't give any specifics, obviously, but what's it like when Archie is in raving lunatic mode?
I mean, I don't know if raving lunatic, I don't know if that's an interesting term, but obviously he's just very intense. Wants guys to get after, wants guys to play hard. So I think he just wants he wants to push us to push other guys as hard as we can go. And I think that can only end up well.
Do you think that's the kind of role that he's going to need to kind of have for the rest of the season? Or do you feel like the internal leadership that you guys have on the team can kind of start to take some of that over?
I think hopefully the internal leadership can get that going. I don't think you want your coach being the guy that's getting you going. I think that's got to come from within. And then obviously he can only help, but I think to be a successful team, that can only come from within.
Yeah. And obviously one of the big leaders on the team is Juwan Morgan, who has made huge strides this year. What kind of trust level do you guys have in Juwan now? And do you kind of look to him as the go-to player now on this team?
Yeah, he's been great for us. I think playing inside and out, he's always a guy you can count on, whether that's scoring, passing, or just being there, making plays, rebounding, playing hard. I think that's something you can always count on from night in and night out. So he's been huge for us.
Obviously, this season there's been some ups, there's been some downs. Now you guys sit here at 8-6. As Big Ten play resumes, what do you think are reasonable expectations for you guys in Big Ten play?
I think just game to game. I know we got Wisconsin coming up on Tuesday, so right now we're 1-1 in the Big Ten. A lot of teams are, so I think it should be an interesting season for us. We'll see how it goes. It should be good for us.
Yeah. And my last question for you, and again, man, thanks for taking the time after the big win over Youngstown State to join us. What, look, I was a kid who grew up in Indiana, grew up going to IU games, would have loved to play at Assembly Hall in front of the IU fans. What has it been like just in general for you these last couple of years to come back to Indiana, to walk on and really to get so much playing time both seasons and to be able to play in front of the IU fans? What has that experience been like?
Yeah, obviously being from Indiana, you always hear about Indiana basketball, how big of a deal it is. So obviously coming home, being able to play in Assembly Hall in front of these fans, it's been very special for me. It's been something, it's an honor every night to be out there, so it's been good.
Well, and your play certainly reflects that. It looks like every time you're out there, you respect the opportunity and play as hard as you can, and I think that's why Indiana fans love watching you so much. So, obviously, we wish you continued good luck and success this season, and thanks again for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Zach.
Yeah.
And joining me now in the second part of this edition of Podcast on the Brink, my usual guest here on POTB, Alex Bozich of Inside the Hall, and our special guest, Andy Bottoms, who usually joins me as my co-host on the Assembly Call IU postgame show, and this season is the new bracketologist for InsideTheHall.com, a role he played at AssemblyCall.com and now is doing for InsideTheHall.com. Gentlemen, great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, listeners just got done listening to the interview that I did with Zach McRoberts. And before we jump in and start talking about Wisconsin and Minnesota and kind of looking ahead to what Indiana has coming up in Big Ten play, Alex, I want to ask you a question about Zach real quick, because obviously we're all surprised, maybe even shocked by how much his role has grown and how much he's been able to take it and run with it, especially from a scoring perspective. From a guy who hasn't really scored these last few games, he's been able to really pick up the pace offensively. And it is surprising, but I'm kind of starting to wonder if it shouldn't be so shocking. And someone brought this up in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum that you look at Zach, and he is a guy who was an Indiana All-Star, played on state title teams at Carmel, went to Vermont, which is a solid mid-major program, played significant minutes there as a freshman. And so, yeah, he came to Indiana. He sat out a year. He's a walk-on. But he's not really the typical guy that you would think of a walk-on, right? And so while it is surprising that he's playing this well, maybe we've underestimated how much he actually brings to the table, and getting this extended run of minutes is kind of showing us what kind of player he is. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I mean, the thing that really just stands out when you watch Zach is the effort that he brings on a game-to-game basis, and you kind of look at some of the other guys and you wonder, why are these guys not bringing the same consistent effort that Zach is? But I've just been impressed with the fact that he really didn't play the first 7 games at all, and then now all of a sudden he's gone from not in the rotation to major contributor in the last 7. And, you spoke about his offense a little bit. I've been impressed. His 3-point shot, I think he's something like 5 of 10 over his last 3 or 4 games from the perimeter. That's something that we really didn't see out of him last year. A willingness to even look at the basket and shoot. And this year he seems a little bit more comfortable. We'll see if that continues. Everyone knows that Indiana obviously needs more perimeter scoring, and if he can be a guy that can even make 35 or 40%, that's better than some of what of his teammates are doing right now. But I'm not really surprised at him being capable. I'm surprised at some of the offensive rebounding numbers that he's putting up in some of these games. I mean, there's been a couple games I think where he's had 5 offensive rebounds. Maybe there's one where maybe he had 7, and the fact that he's been a little bit more aggressive offensively. But he showed last year that he was a capable defender, a guy that hustles. But I think it's becoming clear that Archie's impressed with just his approach to the game and how he knows that he's going to at least get consistent effort out of Zach, and that hasn't always been the case with some of his teammates. So I think that's one reason why he's really one of the most reliable and most counter-knock guys right now, is just because of the fact that on a game-to-game basis, the coaching staff knows what to expect out of him.
Yeah, and Andy, something that you and I always end up talking about on the postgame show when Zach's out there, especially if he's in a lineup with a guy like Freddie McSwain, is it's so hard to play guys like that together because you have 2 non-entities on offense that don't really bring you a whole lot, and Zach is really flipping that narrative right now, and I think everybody has seen that, but when you actually look at the numbers too, in terms of offensive rating, the KenPom stat offensive rating, while he doesn't use a lot of possession, so it's kind of a small sample size, he actually leads the team. So for context, Juwan Morgan's offensive rating is 124.9. Zach's is 125.5. So we may need to retire that that theme on the assembly call. And I think the lineup analysis that you did kind of shows it, because Zach was showing up in almost all the lineups that have performed well this season for Indiana. Zach was showing up in there.
Yeah, it's pretty astounding to look at. Through the Youngstown State game, he leads the team in plus minus by a pretty wide margin over the course of the season. He's at plus 64, and the next closest guy is Colin Hartman at a plus 37. Now, there's a lot of things that we could say about, plus minus and what it means and how and when to use it. But that's a pretty wide gap for a guy who has played, just if you look from a minutes perspective, he's played half as many minutes as even an Al Durham. So let's not hold him to the standard of, comparing him to how many minutes Robert Johnson's played or somebody like that. I mean, he's played half as many minutes as Al Durham, and he leads the team in plus minus, leads him in plus minus kind of per minute, just to try to normalize that a little bit. So yeah, it's at this point, it's tough to argue that IU isn't a better team with him on the floor. And I think the fact that he is starting to look at the basket more and has, he's 5 of 10 in these last 3 games from 3-point range. Again, very small sample size, but just in terms of a willingness to shoot the basketball, regardless of the result, that's a huge change that we've seen in him. And you're hard pressed to see anything other than his minutes continuing to expand as we move forward into Big Ten play. Or back into Big Ten play. I guess I got to get used to saying that. Yeah,
and that's a good transition. I mean, it is important to note that, Zach has had 3 really strong games in a row against Fort Wayne, Tennessee Tech, and Youngstown State. And, none of those teams are ranked higher than 161 in KenPom. And so now the competition, and obviously he was very good against Notre Dame too. So it's not like he hasn't shown that he can't perform well against the better competition. But now the competition is going to ratchet up more consistently. He will, be higher on the scouting report. People will start game planning against him, and he'll have to adjust to the adjustments that are made to him. And so it'll be really interesting to see how he does that. Let's look ahead now to what Indiana is facing as we reopen Big Ten play. The Hoosiers are obviously 1-1 after beating Iowa, losing to Michigan. And now Indiana has 2 straight road trips to a couple of venues that are not our favorite venues to see the Hoosiers play. And obviously, the Kohl Center, we all know Indiana's history there. And while the history at Williams Arena isn't quite as negative, still that is not an arena that anyone ever looks forward to playing to. So Andy, one of the reasons we wanted to bring you on here is to get your insight on those 2 teams, because I think there were let's take Wisconsin first. There were a lot of question marks about Wisconsin entering the season, people wondering if they were going to be able to keep that streak going of top 4 finishes. And I kind of feel like, there were question marks, but I feel like they've even underperformed what the modest expectations that people had for them coming into the season. Is that fair to say?
When you look at who they've lost to, they really don't have a bad loss. The only team, all 7 of them have come to, this is KenPom, but top 75 teams. And even only one of those is out of the top 55. So they've played a relatively, they've played some cupcakes, and they've just kind of lost to most of the good teams they've played. I mean, their best wins were, winning at Penn State by a point, and then they beat Western Kentucky by a point on kind of a bogus, vintage Kohl Center call at the end to, get a guy on the free throw line with just a couple seconds left on the clock. So I think they have really struggled in terms of getting guys to step up. I mean, obviously, what you're going to get out of Ethan Happ, but, Demetric Trice was scoring okay before he's hurt. He's out now. And even some of the guys who had played some minutes that had been in the program for a little while, like a Charlie Thomas, I feel like played more last year than he has this year. So they end up being really young. And if you use the KenPom experience, they're ranked 334th out of 351 teams in experience. So I think they've really struggled with that. And then more recently, injuries have really depleted their backcourt with Trice going out. And then another freshman, Kobe King, is out. So they're really thin in the backcourt, and just from a rotational perspective, playing a lot of freshmen and/or guys who have had very little experience in their time at Wisconsin, even prior to that.
Andy, just looking at their roster and just who they are putting out there on a game-to-game basis, I feel like when Indiana fans watch this game, there's going to be a lot of unfamiliar faces, just because really Ethan Happ is the only guy you look at and say, he's been a really big contributor for Wisconsin in the past. Obviously, Brevin Pritzel and Khalil Iverson have also played roles. But who are maybe 1 or 2 guys when fans watch the game tomorrow that to really watch out for on the Badgers besides Ethan Happ? Who are maybe some players that you see as key matchup for the Hoosiers when the ball tips up tomorrow?
So I'll probably point to the two freshmen who have been getting a lot of playing time. One of those is Brad Davison, who I think has taken the mantle from Juwan Morgan in terms of popping his shoulder back into place during games. He's had a lot of issues with that over the course of the season. Hasn't missed a game yet, but has been a pretty consistent contributor for them, playing a lot of minutes, shooting the ball well from 3-point range, almost 40% from three. So he's a guy definitely to watch. I think he kind of fits the if everybody envisions what they think of a Wisconsin player looking like, and then you look at him tomorrow, it's pretty much exactly what you would picture, I would say. And then Aleem Ford is the other one. He's a 6'8" guy in the front court. So, whoever doesn't draw the assignment on Ethan Happ is going to get the assignment on Ford. And he's been, like all freshmen, a little bit up and down, but has played better in their last 4 games. He's got at least 9 points each of those last 4 games and has done a pretty good job. He can step out and make threes as well, shot the ball really well. In fact, over those last handful of games. So he's a guy, as they, you think about them inverting, playing their big guys outside more. He's a 6'8" guy who's taken 44 of his 65 shots from 3-point range, and he's making, almost 48% of them. So I think those are the two guys, at least, that people won't be familiar with. And I think being able to keep those guys off the 3-point line, not let them get open looks, because they really have proven to be, among, if not the best of the shooters that Wisconsin has. So, I think the Ethan Happ one is obviously a huge one, but I think, those two guys are kind of the X factor type players, where if one of them or both of them, scores in double figures, gets up close to 15 points and really impacts the game from a shooting perspective, as we've seen a number of guys do so far against IU this year, that probably spells bad things for IU.
So I want to discuss if it's reason. I think everybody looks at this as like, okay, if Indiana's going to go into the Kohl Center, break this streak, get a win, this would be the season to do it. So Andy, I want to get your thoughts on that. Before we do that, real quick though, I do want to remind everybody to go check out our friends at HoosierProud.com. There are a lot of reasons why you should do this. The 3 most notable ones are obviously for a T-shirt company, their designs are the most important. And when you go there, I think you'll really be impressed, not just with the designs of the Assembly Call T-shirts and the Inside the Hall T-shirts, because we both have our T-shirts there, but they're officially licensed IU gear. They have some really, really neat shirts, basketball-themed shirts, football-themed shirts, soccer-themed shirts. And they also just have some great designs inspired by unique elements of the Hoosier State. So there really is kind of something there for everybody, whether you're a sports fan or not. If you have any kind of roots in Indiana, HoosierProud.com will have something for you. And what's really cool, another great reason to go there and to buy stuff is they support Indiana-based charities. And so a portion of the proceeds from T-shirt sales will go to support charities that are based in Indiana. And for you, the Podcast on the Brink listener, Hoosier Proud is also really generous. They give you 15% off of your entire order. All you have to do when you go there is use the promo code BRINK, BRINK, and no matter what you purchase, your entire order, you will get 15% off. So make sure you go and check out our friends at HoosierProud.com. We've all, Andy, Alex, me, we've all gotten shirts from their products from there. Really happy with the quality. Their customer service is really good, so we're really proud to have them as a sponsor. And so we'd love to have you go check them out. Again, it's HoosierProud.com, and that promo code is BRINK, BRINK. So Andy, as you look at this, it does seem like probably the best opportunity on paper for Indiana to get a win in the Kohl Center in terms of who, the opponent and what Wisconsin is going through. The question is this particular Indiana team going to be able to get it done on the road? Because obviously, while the team has had some good moments this year, none of those as of yet have come in a true road game.
Yeah, like you said, it feels like if there's a chance that this would be it. I think the one area where you really point to, and this has been, I think, viewed in some ways as a positive and a negative over the course of the season, is but IU does have an experienced backcourt, and that is in stark contrast to what Wisconsin will have out there with, really 2 freshmen and I think a sophomore or a junior who's played very little. They've really got 4 guards left on the roster who are healthy at this point. So, you've got 3 guys who don't have a lot of experience. You'd like to think that that's an area where IU can take advantage a little bit of what's going on there. And to me, it comes down to, how much they can try to bottle up Ethan Happ. He's leading them in scoring, rebounding, and assists. We've seen IU pretty aggressively double the post. And so I would assume that you'll see more of that tomorrow. and it'll be interesting to see how he responds to that. He's proven to be a pretty good passer, and I think he really, it's easy to point to that, but how they are able to defend him without getting into foul trouble is going to be a big one. And conversely, if they can get Wisconsin into foul trouble, which is not something that they typically have issues with, I think if they can do that, really get deeper into their backcourt, I think that can be a turning point for the game. So I think if ever there's a time, this feels like it's got to be it.
The other game that will occur before we have another episode of Podcast on the Brink is Saturday's game at Minnesota. And this is a Minnesota team that was obviously very highly thought of coming into the season. They are 12-3, but currently only 43rd in KenPom. Obviously, they've dealt with some injury issues, not a lot of depth, but they've got a guy in Jordan Murphy who, I saw a stat that was comparing him to Tim Duncan in terms of consecutive double-doubles. And anytime you can get your photo and a stat on the same graphic as Tim Duncan, you're doing something pretty phenomenal. So what is Indiana going to be facing when they head up to Williams Arena on Saturday? And which of these two games do you think is more likely for Indiana to get a win in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll take your last question first. I mean, I would say the Wisconsin game would be the more likely to get a win in, which sounds really, really weird to say. But Minnesota, it's going to be a weird contrast as you look at these two games. They really like to get up and play fast. I think they're in the top 60 in tempo compared to Wisconsin, who ranks around the bottom as they usually do. So, it's going to be, a turnaround of styles even between these couple games. And I haven't heard for sure whether Nate Mason's supposed to be back. I know he sat out the last game. Sounded like there was some chance he would play in that game. So my assumption will be that he'll be back and he'll actually be at full strength because Dupree McBrayer came back to play in that Harvard game, I think is who they played last. So just a lot of guys to account for offensively. And Murphy, as you said, averaging 19 and 12.5 rebounds, 19 points, 12.5 rebounds a game. Incredibly good on the offensive glass and on the defensive glass. So I think rebounding is one of the areas that Archie Miller called out after the Youngstown State game. This will certainly be a test of that because that's one thing that Minnesota does really well. They also take really good care of the basketball. I know IU's been better at forcing teams into turning it over this season, but Minnesota, one of the top teams in the country, and Nate Mason in particular, has one of the lower turnover rates that's out there. So I think rebounding is probably a big one for that one, for that game. Getting to the free throw line, it will also be big because Minnesota does a good, they kind of do what I guess IU wants to do in some ways. They do a good job of getting to the line when you look at the free throw rate, but they don't really put their opponents there quite a bit. So, they block a ton of shots, really hard to make twos against them, which probably scares IU fans a little bit, given that that's really been where the bulk of the offense has come from this year.
Andy, I wanted to transition just a little bit to the Big Ten at large, and I know you're going to start putting out your first bracket here in the next week or a couple weeks here, and bracketology will be a word that college basketball fans are going to hear a lot more often in the new year. But looking at the Big Ten right now, I looked at one of the bracketologies. I don't remember where it was, but I think that the only two teams that, they had obviously Michigan State and Purdue in the tournament. I think Michigan was somewhere like an 8 seed, and then I think Minnesota was something like one of the last 4 in or something like that. I mean, besides the top two, which we know that Purdue and Michigan State are obviously going to make the tournament, and Michigan seems to be in pretty good shape. But who else in the Big Ten, besides maybe Michigan and Minnesota, is even in the conversation at this point? Is there any other teams? It seems like we may be headed for a 4 or 5 bid selection Sunday for the Big Ten this year.
Yeah, those 4 are probably the ones most prominently in the conversation for sure. I think Maryland has been there, but obviously with Justin Jackson being out, I think it's reasonable to question how they're really going to be able to respond to that. They've got the Butler win, which helps them, but they don't really have a truly bad loss. They just don't have a lot of quality wins, and I think those will be harder to come by, obviously, without one of their better players. And really, once you get past that, Ohio State's gotten a little bit of chatter, but when you really look at who they've beaten, I think they've played well in a number of the games that they've lost to good teams, and they got off to that 2-0 Big Ten start. I think that helps. And so, they maybe are a team that kind of plays their way into that conversation. But yeah, it's tough to find somebody who really has multiple quality wins outside of those top few teams. And more than that, there's so many of them that have lost to, kind of so losses. So, if you lose to these top tier teams, nobody's going to worry too much about that. But using Maryland kind of as that example, they lost to St. Bonaventure, another team that might be on the bubble with them. They lost to Syracuse, another team that might be on the bubble with them. So I think those kinds of things, start to hurt a little bit. A lot of the kind of what you'd hope would be, coin flip type games that could go one way or the other seem to nearly all have gone against the league at this point. And even when you look at the league in the aggregate, it's pretty ugly.
So can you paint kind of in your head right now, looking forward, can you paint any type of reasonable scenario that gets Indiana even onto the bubble? I mean, and let's assume for right now that Indiana is going to lose its 2 games to Michigan State and its game to Purdue, even though 2 of those are at home. And I would certainly expect Indiana to be competitive, and maybe they can pull off an upset there. Expecting this team to beat those 2 teams right now seems like quite the daunting challenge. What are the other games that maybe you see as like the swing games that if Indiana can maybe get those and take care of some business, or take care of business in the games that you would kind of assume they'll win, that they could maybe inch their way onto the bubble? Or is it just so far off the radar right now that it's a waste of time to talk about?
I'd say they'd have to finish with a really strong, Big Ten record, quite a few games over 500, just because I think the Indiana State loss in some ways was one that, the committee says that, early games don't matter any more or less than games later in the season. But I think it's one you could have at least tried to explain away a little bit, opening game, first year coach, getting used to the system. And then if you were able to layer on top of that some kind of pattern of, consistent improvement, I think you could kind of explain that one away, for lack of a better term. The Fort Wayne game, I'm not sure that you can make the same argument. You guys have obviously talked a lot about that, so we're not gonna dwell on that too much. I think the big thing is really just road games in general. So the committee has changed the way that they view, the way they kind of categorize these wins. So a road win over a team ranked in the, I think it's top 75 now is kind of I'm going to call it kind of a tier 1 win for lack of a better term. So that's kind of go in one bucket along with your home wins over, teams ranked 1 to 30th in the RPI. So if you can start, the best way to really start to build up some momentum and build up some things in that bucket is to really be able to beat, some of the teams on the road. Now, that Wisconsin game becomes a big one for that, even though they're not ranked particularly high right now because they, haven't played as well. It does provide an opportunity to be able to get a win like that. So I think the road games become really important. Obviously, taking care of business at home is also important, but because you've got a pretty good range, and for as bad as the Big Ten has been, you can feel relatively confident in saying that a lot of the teams are going to end up in the top 75 in the RPI. And so if you want to kind of pad and say, hey, we've got a lot of, top tier wins, you're going to have to do that by winning road games at this point, because it has to outweigh at some point the fact that you have. Outside of those, 2, 20-point losses to in-state teams, none of the losses on the resume are bad at this point. So that part helps. But I think you got to get, it's all relative, but, I think you'd need to be in the, 12-6, maybe I'm going to say 12-6 range in the conference, just to pick up enough road wins and really display that you have gotten that much better at that point to really make a good case. I reserve the right to change my mind on that as, see how other teams play out. But I think you got to aim pretty high at this point to be able to do that. And that gets you to 20 wins on the season as well, or at least get you close to it.
Hey, there's always the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah, well, much like winning at Wisconsin. If ever there's a year, maybe it's now. I don't know, but yeah, everybody feels real comfortable putting a lot of eggs in the Big Ten tournament basket at this point. So yeah.
One of these days, man,
that'll make everybody feel good.
One of these days, it's going to happen. Hey, by the way, do you have any recommendations for NIT bracketologists? Because it doesn't sound like Indiana's going to be popping up a whole lot in your work this year.
Boy, I don't know that I do. I know there are a few people that do it. I actually allowed myself to look at it a little bit a few times over the last few years, and it was just too depressing. So I've tried to block out any memory of who that might be. But if it comes to that point and that looks like where things are going, I'll let everybody know where to go.
Are there, before we wrap up here, Andy, and obviously Alex, if you have anything, hop in too, but are there any other just kind of interesting Big Ten storylines that you're looking at? I mean, I think it's pretty interesting, looking at Michigan State and Purdue. I mean, those two teams are really good, and it's possible. I mean, we just talked about the dearth of bids that the Big Ten may get, but I mean, it's possible that the Big Ten could get, a 1 seed and a 2 seed, or is there, what scenario do you think would have to happen, Andy, for possibly Michigan State and Purdue to get 1 seeds, which I know sounds crazy, but they're the number 2 and number 3 teams in KenPom right now.
Well, the funny thing is you kind of look at the KenPom projected records. You've got the 2 of them get projected at 15-3, and I'm not so sure that Michigan State doesn't even outperform that based on what their conference schedule looks like. And then you've got, I can't, almost everybody else outside of Rutgers is between 6-12 and 11-7. So I think what the Big Ten needs, if they want to get bids, is they need a few of those teams from what looks like a really, really crowded. I think we talked about that even before the season. The middle of the league seemed really crowded. I think it's even more so now. So they need a few of those teams to really assert themselves. And kind of like I said with IU, can some of these teams go, 11-7, 12-6, and really, really separate themselves from everybody else? I think that's one storyline to watch. As you talk about Purdue, I think Michigan State's going to win enough games and had a lot of hype coming into the season where, I don't think that would shock anybody. And Purdue, when you really look, while the first couple games of that battle for Atlantis felt like a disaster for them at the time, Tennessee continues to play really well. So I don't think that loss, an overtime loss to them on a neutral floor, is going to look bad. They're ranked 20th in KenPom right now. In Western Kentucky, who knows what they'll end up being? They've been, they had every chance to win that game at Wisconsin. So they've been pretty good. But I mean, other than that, Purdue's got, I think, if you look at top 55, because there's a couple just outside of that, I think they've got 6 or 7 wins against those kinds of teams in KenPom, and those are going to obviously translate to teams with a pretty good RPI. So they've got a really solid resume when you look at road win at Marquette, beating Arizona, who looks good again all of a sudden. Beating Louisville, who I think may end up struggling to to advance into the tournament at this point. Won at Maryland, beat Northwestern, beat Butler on a neutral floor. So they've got a really good resume. So I think if they do end up in that kind of 15-3 range, I think there's definitely a chance for them to get one of the higher seeds. I don't know if they both can make it onto the 1 line, but I think potential 2 seed for Purdue if they really end up in that 15-3 mark is definitely possible.
Alrighty, well,
way to go! You brought up the Big Ten tournament, and then you made me say nice things about Purdue. Thanks. I expect to not be asked back once the feedback comes in on this episode, so that's good.
No one will blame you. The questioner led you astray. So
leading the witness. All right, fair enough.
That's all right. Not a great start to 2018 for me as Podcast on the Brink host, but I have the whole year to make up for it. So hopefully we can do that. But no, thanks for joining us, Andy. This was a really good insight. Appreciate you taking some time from your New Year celebration to hang out with us here on Podcast on the Brink.
Hey, no problem. It's going to be a busy month. I was just putting stuff on our calendar for January, and 9 IU big games over the course of January. So busy month for us from a post-game show perspective. So buckle up for that.
Yeah. No kidding.
Thanks, Andy.
Yep. Thanks, Andy, and thank you all for being here, listening, and Happy New Year, everybody. Let's obviously 2017 it was kind of a checkered year for Indiana basketball, so I think we all expect better times are ahead for 2018. So let's watch and find out. We'll talk to you all next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.